Welcome to the Iowa Chief Elected Officials Training Module Number 2, CEO Shared Liability Agreement. The objectives of this training module are to build understanding of the CEO Shared Liability Agreement and to introduce tools and best practices to help Iowa CEOs develop the necessary local governance structure for the workforce system in Iowa. Please have the CEO Orientation and Training Guide available as you participate in this training. It can be found on the Iowa State Workforce Development Board website. Before we jump into content, I would like to review for a few minutes some commonly used terms or acronyms that you will see throughout this training. WIOA, or WIOA, is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. This is the piece of federal legislation that governs the workforce system. CEO is Chief Elected Official. CLEO, or CLEO, is the Chief Lead Elected Official. SWDB, or State Board, is referring to the State Workforce Development Board. That board is required in each state and is appointed by the governor. LWDB, or Local Board, is the Local Workforce Development Board and is required for each local workforce development area in the state, and the members of the local board are appointed by the chief elected officials. LWDA is the Local Workforce Development Area. IWD stands for the Iowa Workforce Development Agency. And when we say One Stop or American Job Center, we are referring to an Iowa Works office. The chief elected official of each county has been defined to be the chair of the County Board of Supervisors or a designee from within the Board of Supervisors. In other words, each county in Iowa has a chief elected official, and that official is one of the County Board of Supervisors. CEOs are grouped together based on the local workforce development area configuration. And the role of the CEO is to set the foundation for the local workforce development board by ensuring fiscal integrity and ensuring that the local area is represented by committed and suitable members on the local workforce development board. Additionally, chief elected officials have financial liability for the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act funds that come to their local workforce development area. We will get into a more robust discussion later in this module about that financial liability. However, I mention it here to say that there is no place within the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, its regulations, or policy issued by the Iowa State Workforce Development Board that allows for a chief elected official to delegate away her or his responsibilities as a chief elected official. Additionally, the responsibilities afforded to the chief elected official for purposes of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act are on the unit of government that CEO represents. And the training here today is not intended to convey that there is personal liability on behalf of the individual CEOs. Now, let's jump into the content of the CEO Shared Liability Agreement. We will begin our discussion today about the CEO Shared Liability Agreement on page 31 of the CEO Orientation and Training Guide. Please know that we will move around within the guide, and I will give you the appropriate page numbers as we move around. The purpose of the Shared Liability Agreement is to document how chief elected officials will work together to accomplish the numerous tasks ascribed to them under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Please note that it is required by the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act when a local workforce development area is multi-jurisdictional for there to be an interlocal agreement. These agreements are known in Iowa as 28E agreements. And since you are all elected officials, I'm confident that you have experience with developing and executing 28E agreements. Again, CEOs are grouped together based on the local workforce development area configuration of counties. IWD has provided a template for this shared liability agreement, and it can be found on the Iowa State Workforce Development Board's website. Please note that the template is not a requirement for your group of CEOs to use. However, the sections contained in the agreement are required. So in other words, you are free to create your own 28E agreement for purposes of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. However, you will need to refer to the template provided to ensure that you have the appropriate sections contained in your agreement. Section 1 of the Shared Liability Agreement references the Chief Lead Elected Official. You can turn to page 15 in your guide for more detailed information. The Chief Lead Elected Official, or CLEO, is one of the chief elected officials and is selected from among the group. The CLEO represents the other elected officials and makes decisions on their behalf. And the CLEO also serves as the designated signatory for any documents from IWD that require signature. For Section 1 of the Shared Liability Agreement, chief elected officials need to determine 1, what the process will be to determine their CLEO, and 2, need to carry out that process and select their CLEO. In addition, the CEOs need to determine and document in the Shared Liability Agreement what decisions and actions the CLEO may take on their behalf. Section 2 of the Shared Liability Agreement references the Local Workforce Development Board and its appointments. In your guide, you may find more detailed information on this topic on pages 17 and 18. Let me also point out that this topic has a lot of information, and as such, we've created a separate module for purposes of outlining the Local Workforce Development Board membership categories. I would recommend that after completing this module that you also watch that module to ensure that you have all of the content necessary. The Local Workforce Development Board is a separate entity from the group of chief elected officials. There is separate membership and there are separate tasks. The chief elected officials appoint the Local Workforce Development Board, and therefore chief elected officials decide the size of the board. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act provides clear guidelines for who can serve on a local workforce development board. Just to be clear, there are two distinct and separate groups that provide governance and oversight of the workforce system at the local level: the chief elected officials and the Local Workforce Development Board. These are separate groups, and apart from the roles specified within the law as being done collaboratively, these groups should function separately from each other. Section 3 of the Shared Liability Agreement is around the topic of the fiscal agent. In your guide, you can find more detailed information on the fiscal agent on page 20. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act states that the CLEO may designate a fiscal agent. Just to be clear, the CLEO would be doing this designation on behalf of the chief elected officials, and this is intended to be a decision point that the chief elected officials work together on. Should a fiscal agent not be designated for purposes of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act funds that come to the local workforce area, the CLEO's unit of government shall fulfill the role. In other words, there will be an entity at the local workforce development area that serves as the fiscal agent. By default, it is the unit of government for the CLEO. However, the CLEO may designate another entity to serve that function. What organizations can serve as fiscal agent? What is key in answering this question is that the organization or entity selected to serve as fiscal agent must be able to receive, report, and track federal funds. They must be familiar with generally accepted accounting principles and be familiar with OMB and the appropriate circulars and policies and guidance around the expenditure, tracking, and reporting of federal funds. Should the role of fiscal agent be procured or not? When we say procured, we're referring to a competitive bid process. The law does not require for the role of fiscal agent to be competitively bid. Iowa Workforce Development Policy also does not require the procurement. However, chief elected officials are more than welcome to determine the fiscal agent through a competitively procured process. To whom does the fiscal agent report? While the designation of the fiscal agent rests with the chief elected officials, once that designation has been made, the fiscal agent technically reports to the local workforce development board. The fiscal agent would be involved in day-to-day operational matters as it relates to the funding the board receives. Any contract issued for purposes of fiscal agent services should reflect that the agent reports to the local workforce development board. Additionally, to ensure conflict of interest is minimized, the organization or entity designated to serve as fiscal agent may not serve in any other selected or designated role within the local workforce system. Additionally, there are 4 selected roles in the local structure of the workforce system: fiscal agent, board staff, one-stop operator, and service providers. The FIREWALLS policy states that the entity selected to serve as fiscal agent is not permitted to also serve as board staff, one-stop operator, or as a service provider. Section 4 of the Shared Liability Agreement is the section where the method for sharing liability of funds will be described. In the event of misspent or mismanaged funds that requires repayment of those funds to IWD or the U.S. Department of Labor, the CEOs must have outlined a process for determining each CEO's share of the responsibility. In other words, in the event that there has been a disallowed cost identified through an audit, and it is determined that those funds must be repaid, and it is determined that the entity responsible for incurring the cost either cannot or will not issue the repayment of those funds falls on the chief elected officials of that local workforce development area. Also, to be clear, it is the responsibility of the unit of government and not the personal responsibility of the chief elected officials. Further, in such an instance where a repayment is necessary, the repayment must happen with non-federal funds. In Section 4 of the Shared Liability Agreement, CEOs are going to identify the method they will use for sharing that cost. Additionally, in Section 4, CEOs will identify what steps they will take to ensure that there is a recapture of disallowed costs or an attempt to recapture disallowed costs before the cost is incurred by their units of government. So what is the process that CEOs will use to recapture those disallowed costs? Additionally, on this slide, we have provided the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act specific citation around the sharing of the liability. Section 5, Significant Decisions in Collaboration with the Local Workforce Development Board. As you recall, on Section 2, when we were talking about the distinction between the group of chief elected officials and the local workforce development board, there are separate and clear duties. However, there are 6 areas or 6 specific duties that are shared between the two groups. Both groups are required to collaborate in order to accomplish these tasks. Today, and in this module, we are going to highlight or identify what those 6 task areas are, but then we are only going to focus in on one, as the others will be covered in subsequent training. The 6 key duties are: develop and submit the local plan, provide WIOA program oversight, select the one-stop operator, approve the local workforce development board budget, agree on the memorandum of understanding, and finally outline the criteria by which the CLEO shall agree to a local board's request to provide career services or serve as a one-stop operator. We are going to look at the one task shared between the chief elected officials and the local workforce development board that revolves around the selection of the one-stop operator. Additionally, in your guide, there is more specific information on this task on pages 22 and 23. For starters, a one-stop is in Iowa one of the Iowa Work Centers. The purpose of the one-stop operator, as defined by the federal law, is to coordinate all activities and functions performed by the various one-stop partners. Also, to ensure services provided are fully integrated and are of the highest quality. The law is very clear that the one-stop operator role must be competitively procured at least every 4 years. Again, competitively procured references doing a bid process to identify the best provider of this service. Also, Chief elected officials and the local workforce development board are jointly responsible for this task. As with the role of the fiscal agent, there is also a firewall that comes into play regarding the one-stop operator. To ensure conflict of interest is minimized, the entity selected through competitive procurement to serve as the one-stop operator is limited on other roles it can fulfill within the local workforce system. The one-stop operator shall not serve as the fiscal agent or as staff to the local workforce development board. The only other roles permitted for the entity selected as the one-stop operator include provider of career services and/or youth provider. We reference once again the chart that you saw earlier. The 4 roles in the local workforce system structure: fiscal agent, board staff, one-stop operator, and service provider. The firewall policy surrounding the one-stop operator states that the entity selected to be the one-stop operator can also be the service provider or a service provider, but the entity chosen to be the one-stop operator cannot serve as fiscal agent and cannot serve as staff to the local workforce development board. Section 6 of the Shared Liability Agreement is where each of the chief elected officials and their contact information, along with the county they represent, would be listed. Section 7 calls for a dispute resolution process. This is where CEOs will identify how they will settle disputes or disagreements regarding their roles as chief elected officials for the local workforce development area. Section 8, the annual budget review and approval process. This is where the chief elected officials will identify how they want to go about completing the task of reviewing the annual local workforce development board budget and giving their approval on that. This may include outlining what reports and when the chief elected officials need from the fiscal agent. Again, this is done annually based on how the WIOA funding is allocated. It should also be noted that the review of the budget is a process or a task that the CEOs share with the local workforce development board. However, the approval of the budget is done by the chief elected officials. So in other words, the local board can approve the budget themselves, but it's not officially the budget until it has the approval of the chief elected officials. Section 9 is where the chief elected officials will identify what process they will use to make amendments to their shared liability agreement. Section 10 is for when there is a new chief lead elected official designated based on the process in Section 1 that the chief elected officials outlined. Section 10 references an acknowledgement from that new CLEO that she or he has read and understands and will comply with the current CEO agreement, and also what steps you will take to apprise IWD of the change in the CLEO designation. And lastly, Section 11. This is when there is a new chief elected official that joins the group, and there is an acknowledgement required that she or he has read and understands and will comply with the current CEO agreement. Additionally, you will outline how that CEO can go about requesting negotiations or modifications to amend the CEO agreement at any time during their tenure as a CEO. That concludes the sections required in the CEO Shared Liability Agreement. Again, IWD has provided a template for the agreement. However, the use of that template is not required, but the sections that we just reviewed are. Keep in mind that once the contents of the agreement have been identified, each CEO must adhere to her or his process for ratification by their county board of supervisors. You will need to build that step into your timeline based on the due date of the shared liability agreement to IWD. Additionally, such a review or such a ratification may include a review by the county attorney. And in a situation where you have multiple counties, it could include reviews by multiple county attorneys. You just need to be aware of that as you begin the process of developing the Shared Liability Agreement or 28E agreement. And finally, when the CEO Shared Liability Agreement is sent to IWD, IWD will file it with the Secretary of State's office on behalf of the CEOs and will provide acknowledgement back to the CLEO when that process has been complete. Should you have any questions or comments or need further clarification on any of the content covered in this module, please send an email to wioagovernance@iwd.iowa.gov or send an email to Michelle McNertney at iwd.iowa.gov. Thank you for your time today.